My notion of anti-liberalism is the organizing framework for my current book project. And in it, I take as a starting point the very many narratives that we get from economic historians, particularly liberal or so-called classic liberal economists, that tell us that before the U.S. Civil War, we lived in a moment of American liberal democracy that was freer than any other moment in human history. It's kind of painted as this like golden age of government non-intervention in economy. And they argue that with the Civil War and the rise of federal government, we get more and more and more expansion and proliferation of government controls that make us today less free than we've ever been, and every day continually less free. And those narratives, I argue, are not only insidiously skewed, but also false, because what they do is they isolate government control and define it before the Civil War as only as it affects citizens of the United States. And as we all know, citizen in the United States before the Civil War excluded millions of enslaved African Americans. It excluded Native Americans that were still occupying and resisting against displacement during removal, and it, of course, excluded female and women's enfranchisement in suffrage. So what I argue anti-liberalism as is a new framework for thinking about how our government manages our everyday lives, particularly in ways that manage our bodies. And I argue that instead of thinking about the U.S. Civil War as a moment where American citizens began this path towards fewer and fewer freedoms, I actually argue that we can turn to the way that racialized enslavement was authorized in this pre-Civil War, pre-emancipation moment. And actually, that is where we see the logic for subordinating human life to capitalist ideals. So rather than reading the post-emancipation increase in government regulations as a decrease in freedoms, instead what we see is a broadening of enslaving logic that was already developed and working efficiently and insidiously in racialized slavery. In other words, what I say is that if we turn to something like the proliferation of mental institutions in the early 20th century, something that affected humans across race, gender, sexuality, all poverty level or wealth level, we can see that the same kind of values and the same kind of process of relegating, of exploiting, and of erasing those people, that was already a logic we were doing before emancipation, and it already benefited capitalism in ways that were refined before emancipation. But now we see it applying beyond markers of race and extended to markers of disability and markers of gender and markers of class and sexuality as well. In the 21st century, I argue that even if one's identity today might not have been enslaved at the time of enslavement, I still argue that the logics established against the black body in racialized slavery before emancipation, that logic still informs the way that, say, LGBTQ persons are rendered vulnerable, because that logic is still rooted in the triangulation of corporality, capitalism, and citizenship, something that was founded and developed on the enslaved black body. There's definitely no material equity between, say, like the violence of, for example, what was called at the time like slave breeding, the systemic rape and sexualized violence and horror that we see in texts like Harriet Jacobs' incidents. That's not the same thing as prohibiting a white couple in rural Mississippi from getting married because they may or may not be cousins. It's in no way comparable in terms of material experience or violence. I'm not saying those are equal. What I'm saying is that they proceed from a similar logic. That if we understand that logic, then we can fight the root of the logic across different experiences.